welcome back into the lecture series in animal physiology. So, we have finished 6 weeks, so we are starting the 7th week. So, if you remember in the last week, we talked about the different forms of memory. So, we started with epilepsy, then we talked about different forms of memory, which includes long-term potentiation, long-term depression, the very basic models. And then we discussed about the emergent behavior in terms of the time where in the space matrix of the brain the changes happen at the level of synapse, and those changes are irreversible changes. In other words, if you remember the drawing which I was drawing, so you have this brain at different time points, any brain at different time points. So, what you acquire at the age of say 10 adds up on what you acquire at the age of by the age of 20, by the age of 30, by the age of 40, likewise so on. And every time, either you can call it like layer after layer, the information kind of get accumulated or gets partly modified, keeping the base information the same, or evolve about a particular stuff. So, it is something like, say for example, you learn a law or you learn something, and over the years of practicing or kind of thinking over it, you evolved a much improvised version of that particular thing. So, that is kind of an emergent property, and it is a function of space and time, the changes happening over a period of time in a space matrix which is the brain. So, while closing in on that, in the last week I told you that you are you, I am. It is because within my brain matrix there is an identity I have developed, my name, my association, whom I know, my country, my society, my language, my religion, what not. These are nothing but pieces of information in our system which are believed to be stored in the synapse. Now, think of a situation if some way or other those informations which are stored at different part of the brain started to wipe out, and if that happens, then it may lead to a situation where you lose your own identity. You cannot recognize who are you, because informations which associate you with the surrounding, so your near and dear ones, so the locality where you stay, or the people whom you know, is that started to fade out. So, you are no more you then, and that is something where we call there is a loss of memory. The informations which are stored in you, what makes you as you, is now getting lost. So, with this informal introduction, I will switch over to the concept or our understanding about, or our very limited understanding about diseases like Alzheimer's, dementia. So, today's or this week we are starting with some of the memory related disorders and whatever we know about it. So, start off with, so we are into week 7, lecture 1, W7L1, and what we will be dealing with will be Alzheimer's disease. So, I will just quote you a story written by Ira B. Black. And the title of the book is Death of Enoch Wallace. This is a scientific primer or a scientific novel written by late Professor Black somewhere around between 2000 and 2003, somewhere at that time when this book was released. And that was the time when I read this book. So the story goes like this. So here is a gentleman called Enoch Wallace, who is a banker in New York, very high profile job, and a very well accomplished person in the finance sector, and lives in Manhattan. It's a wonderful locality. So one morning, Mr. Wallace wake up and kind of for a fragment of a moment kind of got confused where is the restroom or the bathroom in his own house. But then he just kind of ignored. Eventually he found it, went to the restroom, got ready, and this is a financial banker who is very meticulous about how to put the tie and what the belt and everything, like absolutely very, I won't call it finicky, or very particular about everything, very meticulous about dressing up. Here that day he was kind of a little careless. I think he's a bit lost, and this was noticed by his wife. But nevertheless, he went out for his to start his day. So one of these days, while he was coming back, had a big meeting and something, a place where he used to walk back, he kind of started losing track that which street is his house. So, or which avenue is his house. That was something very unusual for him, because he had been coming there for, as the backdrop says, for years and decades. For him to forget that was something very unusual. So apparently it was kind of, he was kind of realizing that as if his sense for space, in a space here I mean the geographical space, like I'm standing here and this is a studio, outside there is a room, and then as I go outside this building, there is on my left hand side corner there will be a parking way, and then on the right hand side, if I move along, there will be the main gate. I come out of it, there is the road. On the right hand side I'll have my academic area. So there are certain space map which is there stored in my brain somewhere or other in my synapses. So this gentleman was realizing that he's losing sense of that space, and as if his geography was kind of getting compromised. And this pattern started to progress further, and his wife was worried and took him to consult. Initially the suspicion was that because of overwork and fatigue, this gentleman is kind of losing track. But then some of the best neurologists figured out that he is losing his memory, and that is happening because he is in the very, very early stages of Alzheimer's disease. And then of course this story will continue, and I recommend those of you can really pull this book online. You should read it. It will take you to through the crest and trough achievements and agonies of neuroscience of last 100 years. It's one mesmerizingly beautiful novel where late Professor Black, on the backdrop of a patient, explained the science. Probably one of the finest book I have read, and had the fortune to grab it while flying out from one of the airports. So it is extremely logical and informative book. But now coming back, what is happening to this gentleman? What really Alzheimer's means? So this will take us back to where memory acquisition was happening, if you remember. So your memory acquisition process was, as we discussed in the last week, it was all happening in the, or at least by our best of our understanding, your random access memory, or that buffer where the first set of memories were being acquired, was the hippocampus, or is the hippocampus. So in the hippocampus, if you recollect the circuit what we have talked about the hippocampus, just a little recap about the brain. And okay, and we talked about the hippocampus sitting out here, right? Now out here, when I drew the circuit, I told you that if you place like this, this is the dentate gyrus what I am drawing now, DG, and this hippocampal region has this CA1, CA2, CA3, CA4 pathways, different emergent pathways which are there in the hippocampus. Okay, CA1, CA2, CA3 and CA4. So, and in one of the drawing I showed you that these have this pyramidal architecture of neuron, where the cell body is almost like a pyramid, and these are the dendritic terminal, and this is an axon which is going up, and here you have the nucleus. So a classic pyramidal neuron looks more like, exactly under the microscope, this is how they look like, having a long axonal terminal, and here you are having the dendritic tree. You have the nucleus, here you have the axon, dendrites, cell body, nucleus. So hippocampus is primarily the network of these pyramidal shape neurons. This is pyramidal hippocampal neuron. So now if you observe these patients, these cells slowly starts to degenerate, and the way they degenerate is very interesting. The way they degenerate is slowly this connecting channel of axon started to die off. It's kind of slowly this, and eventually the dendritic tree dies off. So, it seems in a circuit where you have a neuron which is connected to the other one, that slowly dies off. And one of the very classic feature, so there are a lot of theories and I will not get into that because, but what has been the emerging property, what has been observed is that if you look at this axon is where the neurotransmitters are getting transmitted. If you remember when we talked about the neurotransmitters getting transmitted at these terminals, and that is where the neurotransmitters are being ejected out, and the dendrites of the other cell kind of pick them up, bind there, and then open the ion channels and they move, and that is why how the signal gets transmitted. So, if you really blow up this part of the axon, you will see this axon is almost like as if there has been a railway line which has been spread out there, something like this. This is kind of an analogy what I am drawing. Suppose you are standing and seeing the rail tracks, it will almost looks like rail track, and along these rail tracks you will observe the movement of the neurotransmitters. Now, suppose this rail track becomes something like this. On the rail track, if you see the tracks become something like this instead of this, where the track starts to getting bit of a damaged, and what will you observe is there will be accumulation of certain unusual protein like A beta, and there are several others which are slowly emerging like this, and the proper transport is kind of neurotransmitters and other molecule is kind of getting hampered. So, apparently it will look like the trafficking of the molecules all the way from the cell body to the axon terminal and vice versa, the retro messenger going in the opposite direction from the from the axonal terminal to the cell body is molecular traffic is compromised. Molecular trafficking is compromised, and this is what exactly happens in the case of Alzheimer's, where this part out here things are getting compromised, and till this date nobody can tell with certainty that why such situation arose or arises. We do not know, but what we know is because of this these cells started to die, and especially in this region, and eventually the network between these pathways are slowly started to degenerate, and the more it degenerates, more you start losing the informations at different parts of the brain. And the major beginning is in the hippocampal region. It's not the complete cell dies immediately. It takes time for it to die. And the next thing you see, there will be, these kind of perforations, kind of structures which started to arise before the cell finally dies. And the brain weight kind of goes down significantly because of significant death of the cells in the hippocampal region. So, this is what happens in a patient suffering from Alzheimer's, a loss of memory, loss of self. So, it is one of the very dreaded disorders of the brain which has rocked mankind, because once you lose, you are completely at the mercy, or your whole lifestyle has now under the governance of Alzheimer's home, the nurses and the system. So, there are tremendous efforts which are happening across the world to understand this brain disorder. There is certain progress, but still we have a long way to go before we really understand why all of a sudden this kind of neurodegeneration happens at certain specific part of the brain. And one common theme, if you kind of look through, you will see that it is the same region where we started talking about epilepsy. You remember? It is the same region where we talk about our memory model LTP and LTD, and it is the same region where we are now talking about AD or Alzheimer's disease. Hippocampus in the last whole century, since the time when doctors in Montreal performed that interesting surgery of removal of hippocampus, since that time until this day, in the cornerstone of newer and newer discoveries, where people have invested tremendous amount of part of their career to understand why this happens. As of now, regarding Alzheimer's, we really cannot pinpoint where the problem and how it all starts. Is it genetically predisposed, or is it some kind of a hyperexcitable damage, or is it because of the accumulation of oxidants or oxidative damage, or something we still are yet to discover. So, with this bit of memory, I will close in this class for you to think what this dreaded disease is, and keep yourself updated. And please, if you get a chance, kindly read the Ida B. Black's book, The Death of Enoch Wallace. Thank you, and thanks for your patient listening, and hope someday the Alzheimer's patient will be cured.